He was born into a palace that gleamed with gold, but every breath he took was laced with the curse of blood too closely tied. Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, emerged into the world not as a prince destined for glory but as the slow, decaying echo of a dynasty that had, quite literally, consumed itself. From the moment he drew his first fragile breath in 1661, it was clear that something was deeply wrong. He could not speak until he was 4. He could not walk until he was 8. And even then, his steps were uncertain, his words thick and garbled, muffled by a tongue so swollen it filled his mouth like a grotesque sponge. Every royal decree he uttered came not with authority, but with a struggle, his tongue too large, his jaw too malformed, his mind swimming in a haze. The most powerful empire in the world looked to a boy who could barely feed himself. But Charles was not cursed by the gods or marked by demons. His affliction was far more human and far more horrifying. His family, the Spanish Habsburgs, had married cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, for over 200 years. Not for love, not even for lust, but for power and obsessive need to keep bloodlines pure and thrones secure. And in that dark, noble ambition, they unknowingly wrote their own death sentence. Charles too was the product of generations of incestuous union, where the same genes were folded and folded again, until what remained was less a man and more a fragile vessel filled with ancient ghosts. By the time Charles took the throne, his health was collapsing from the inside out. He was infertile. His body was constantly racked with illness. He suffered from seizures, hallucinations, and bizarre moments of confusion that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. His physicians, dozens of them, were mystified. Some whispered that he was bewitched. Others thought him possessed. But when he died at just 35 years old, the truth was laid bare on the autopsy table. His body, they said, was that of a 90-year-old man. His brain was underdeveloped, his skull filled with fluid, the mind of a child trapped in a dying husk of a king. Yet what haunts history is not just the image of Charles alone in his sickbed, surrounded by anxious servants and trembling priests. It is the fact that this was all preventable. The Habsburg jaw, the long nose, the withered intellect, these were not accidents. They were the brutal costs of empire, of royal vanity, of a belief that bloodlines were sacred and nature could be bent to the will of kings. Charles was not simply born sick. He was designed that way by centuries of power-hungry ancestors who refused to let outsiders into their family circle, turning the royal household into a genetic prison. His birth was not a beginning, it was the final exhale of a dying line. And when he died, childless and broken, the Spanish Habsburg dynasty died with him. But here's the twist that history never forgets. Charles had a sister, Margarita Teresa of Spain. She had the exact same bloodline, the same inbreeding, the same tangled family tree. And yet, she was nothing like him. While Charles stumbled through life, Margarita danced, laughed, governed. She inherited the infamous Habsburg jaw, yes, and a formidable nose that seemed carved by the same ancestral hand, but she was intelligent, vivacious, fertile. She bore children, navigated court politics, and held her own in the ruthless chess game of European dynasties. She was, in every way, the opposite of her brother, a living contradiction to the genetic curse that had ruined him. But fate, as always, demands balance. Margarita was married off not to a stranger, not even to a distant cousin, but to her own maternal uncle. Another loop in the Habsburg spiral, another knot tied in blood. And though she seemed to thrive, her children were not so lucky. The next generation, once again, born from uncle and niece, showed the same signs. The Habsburg features intensified, intelligence dulled, fertility waned. It was as though nature had given one final warning through Margarita. You got away this time. You won't again. What makes this story truly chilling isn't just the deformity, the madness, or the royal downfall, it's how deliberate it all was. These were not accidents. These were decisions made in gold-embellished halls by men and women who believed themselves divine. They saw blood as holy, royal as eternal. And yet, with every cousin they married, they narrowed the path for their descendants until it led to one boy with a swollen tongue, a child's mind, and the body of an old man. A boy who could not produce an heir, because his body had forgotten how. A boy who could not rule, because his mind had never fully arrived. And perhaps that is what makes Charles II more than just a tragic figure. Perhaps it makes him a symbol of power unchecked, of arrogance mistaken for destiny. of empires that rot from the inside not through war or famine but through the quiet, relentless erosion of nature itself. There is a strange poetry in the way he died. No battle, no rebellion, no betrayal, just decay. As though time itself grew tired of the Habsburgs and let them dissolve into dust. No heirs, no future, just a crypt sealed with the sound of a collapsing dynasty. In the end, Charles's story is not just about royal blood or twisted family trees. It's about what happens when we try to control nature with tradition, when we confuse purity with strength, and when we believe we can outwit evolution itself. The Spanish Habsburgs ruled one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen. They commanded armies, owned continents, shaped history. But their greatest enemy wasn't a rival kingdom or a rebellious subject. It was their own blood, and in the quiet darkness of Charles II's chamber, history whispered its warning. Even kings cannot escape the price of their own design. She was born into a cage lined with silk, a daughter of emperors, a girl bred not for freedom but for purpose. Margarita Teresa of Spain, the precious sister of Charles II, was a living gamble in a dynasty obsessed with blood. To look at her was to see the Habsburg name etched into flesh. The long aquiline nose, the protruding jaw, the deep eyes that carried the heavy knowledge of too many ancestors. But unlike Charles, Margarita was sharp, alert, alive. She could speak, walk, dance, argue. She could bear children. And in that single ability so prized in royal courts, she became the crown jewel of Europe's genetic chessboard, a symbol of hope for a crumbling dynasty. But what no one spoke aloud, what flickered behind every courtly smile and gilded portrait, was this: she, too, carried the curse. She was only 15 when they shipped her across the continent, from Madrid to Vienna, to marry her own uncle Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor. 26 years her senior. In another world, it might have been a crime. In the Habsburg world, it was strategy. The goal wasn't love, it wasn't even alliance, it was control, consolidation, assurance that the royal blood would remain untouched by outsiders. Margarita, already shaped by generations of inbreeding, was asked to contribute her own womb to the same spiral. And so, history repeated itself again and again, but Margarita was no mere pawn. By all accounts, she was fiercely intelligent, politically aware, and emotionally grounded. She wrote letters, debated policy, comforted diplomats, bore for children, and still found time to entertain her court with wit and charm. She seemed, for a moment, to defy the very blood that made her, but the body has a memory, a hidden archive of every genetic mistake, every ancient flaw passed down like a whisper through the centuries. Her health began to deteriorate not long after her marriage. She suffered multiple miscarriages. Her surviving children were frail. She began to lose strength, and her once vivid letters took on a tone of exhaustion, of quiet resignation. At just 21, Margarita Teresa of Spain was dead, her body too fragile to carry the weight of the legacy she was born to protect. But her death wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the final act. Her daughter, Maria Antonia, became the next vessel. A child born of uncle and niece, groomed now to marry her cousin, another twisted branch on the Habsburg family tree. And so it continued, each generation more fragile, each face more haunted. By the time the War of the Spanish Succession exploded across Europe in the early 1700s, the dynasty had fractured beyond repair. Territories were carved up. Thrones were claimed and contested. And everywhere, there was the shadow of Charles, of Margarita, of a family that had waged war against nature and lost. What makes the Spanish Habsburgs so uniquely terrifying isn't just the physical deformity or the tragic deaths, it's the arrogance. The cold, calculated decision to ignore biology for the sake of image, to reject outsiders not because they were unworthy, but because they were unfamiliar, because they weren't us. The idea that royal blood was so holy, so untouchable, that it could be folded in on itself forever. But what they didn't realize, what they refused to see, was that blood is not a symbol. It is chemistry, it is fragile. And when tampered with, it breaks. And yet, for all the tragedy, for all the suffering, there is a strange allure to the Habsburg story, a dark poetry. Because buried beneath the gold and velvet was a family willing to pay any price to keep power in their grasp. Even if that price was the minds and bodies of their children, even if it meant turning their family tree into a noose. Perhaps that's why their story continues to haunt us, because it's not just about royalty. It's about what happens when identity becomes obsession, when purity becomes poison, when the fear of losing control pushes a people and empire into madness. We still see echoes of it today. In the desire to preserve lineage, in the fear of outsiders, in the desperate clinging to tradition, even when the cracks are clearly visible. The Habsburgs didn't just rule history, they warned it. Their lives became a prophecy, a grim reminder that power, left unchecked, will always eat itself. That beauty, prestige, even divine right, mean nothing to the forces that govern life and death. And that the body, no matter how royal, cannot be fooled forever. When Charles II died, he didn't just close a chapter, he closed a book written in bone and blood. And though empires rose in his wake, though his lands were divided and fought over by newer, stronger kings, his legacy lingered. In portraits that show a boy too tired to rule. In autopsy notes that read like horror fiction. In letters from his sister that end with silence. The Spanish Habsburgs believed they were building a dynasty eternal. But what they truly built was a slow-motion tragedy, one that played out not on battlefields, but in nurseries, sickbeds, and marriage contracts inked in fear. And now, centuries later, we look back, not with scorn, but with a strange, solemn reverence. As if we're peering into the remains of a collapsing cathedral once magnificent, now hollowed by its own weight. Because history isn't just what survives, it's also what breaks, what decays. What warns us in whispers, if we're willing to listen.